Before we dive into today's episode, I have something truly special to share. Next September, I'll be leading an intimate women's retreat through the south of France and northern Italy, and you're invited. Picture this: mornings exploring the colorful markets of the French Riviera, afternoons sipping wine, and a hotel view with golden Mediterranean sunsets. Whether you love photography, food, or just want to reconnect with your playful creative self, this trip is designed for you. Spots are limited, so if all this sounds like your kind of adventure, please visit tourwithabsolutely.com and look for the tour France and Italy with Crystal. You can also send me a message or check out the show notes. Hey guys, my name's Crystal Kenny, and I'm in love with creating. All things artistic and imagination involved. I'm an American girl who chased her creative dreams all the way to Paris, France, making a living using photography. This podcast takes you inside the stories of all the artsy folks I've met along the way and gives you that extra push to discover your creative gifts. The desire to create is deeply inside each and every one of us, and I give you the tools and inspiration to find a new way of living a more creative life. This is La Vie Creative, the podcast. So welcome to the show, Elizabeth. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me here.
Thanks so much for making time to chat with me today. You have been traveling the world, a lot of Asia. You're back in Paris. You make beautiful artwork out of textiles and paper. Let's talk a little bit about what brought you back to France, though, after spending, 2 decades now in Asia?
Yes, actually, my original plan was to move back to Europe quite a bit earlier, but I found Asia very interesting. But there came a time when I just felt like I was ready for a real change and to properly settle down a bit more and really grow some roots, because when you travel for so long, you move from place to place, you perhaps could use some roots and really be truly based somewhere. I missed having a language, living in a language that I felt like home and felt familiar. I'm not fluent in French, but it was one of the first 2 languages I learned, and I enjoy the language a lot. I enjoy the culture and the people. So it's really exciting to be back.
Definitely. And let's talk a little bit about your unique practice. So you're working on handmade paper, beeswax, photosensitive inks. What drew you to these materials, and how do they shape the stories you tell through your art?
In a way, it kind of started quite young, I suppose, as for a lot of artists. I started out as a history major in university, even though I always wanted to do art. Somehow, because my parents were academics, history seemed a more logical choice than art, which also they didn't approve of art at all. But eventually art won over, and I realized this is what I needed to do. So in a sense, I have combined the history with my art making processes. So I'm a contemporary artist, like they say in French, a plasticienne. And the materials I work with tend to be older, but I use them with contemporary concepts. So during university, I got a grant to study encaustic wax painting, which is a 2,000-year-old painting technique from the Mediterranean. You can see it in ancient Egypt and also in the Greco-Roman world. A lot of those mummy paintings that you see in big museums will be made from that kind of material. So in a sense, as I come back to Paris, I'm returning to media that I used some years before because I feel I have space to settle in here, intellectual space. There's a spirit of experimentation here that I've really been craving, and where people are interested. They're interested to talk about art and interested to see it. So the encaustic wax painting is one thing that I'm getting back into. Cyanotype, which is a 19th century photo process. A lot of people use it. It's very common. It's a very relatively straightforward technique to do at a basic level. But when I lived in Beijing for 4 years, I started to actually use it as an ink painting medium. And so I work on large sheets of handmade paper and paint it in the dark. I can't really see what I'm doing. And then in the sunlight, it turns blue. And it's kind of an exciting process because I never know how it's going to work. And then the other thing I'm doing here quite a bit, which is essentially a big part of my business plan here, because it's hard to find people making papier de chiffon these days anywhere in France, but there are quite a few wonderful paper makers making it in the countryside. However, I'm an urban person. I love big cities. Paris seems like a really nice size for me at 10 million people, just 2 million of us in the center. And so I thought, well, I'll bring my paper making machine from Hong Kong to Paris and let's see what happens. Essentially, because paper makers around the world, so I'm a contemporary artist who makes paper, but we all use what grows around us, right? So paper is made from water, some sort of fiber, usually always some sort of plant fiber, and then some sort of glue to stick it together. And as an artist who lives in cities, what grows around me is textiles. It's waste. It's a lot of, this is what we produce, this is what we live in. And a lot of these textiles that we use, especially denim, are made of cotton, which is a wonderful material for paper. Actually, some of the highest quality artist papers today made in Europe are from cotton. And so that's what I like to use for my primary material, textiles that have a history, that have a story, and then I incorporate that story into the papers that I make.
Yeah, so talk a little bit more about those stories. Like, what are some of the past stories you've told through your art, and what are you working on now?
Sure. So the papers that I've used in the past and the work that I make is always a reflection of my interaction as a human being, as an artist, as an immigrant, because I've been an immigrant for 25 years of my life, as an immigrant with the places that I am. And during the pandemic, I really started to do a lot of printing with architecture. So essentially, if you're a printmaker, you create some sort of base for your print, whether it's a woodblock print, that'll be a woodcut, or it's working in metal if you're doing engraving, other sorts of, printing techniques that you can use. But for me, the world, the urban places that I live, that is my printmaking surface. So I often work with floors or windows or various architectural elements where I live. And so in a sense, that's an important part of my process. And so I take the materials that grow where I am. In Hong Kong, it was actually, I used a lot of Chinese and Thai papers, and I knew the paper makers who made them. We discussed how it was going to be made because they really, yes, I could make some Asian papers. However, I really feel that as a Westerner, someone who has a platform in English, I'm keen to promote the work of the people that I work with who may not otherwise have access to an English speaking audience. Like in a way, that's my role when I work with these paper makers. So my role when I work with paper makers, in these parts of the world is really to kind of incorporate that into my work and also their story as well. So as someone who is now making paper in Paris, it's important to me to, look at where I am and the materials that are produced around me. And one thing that's interested me a lot since looking at moving here again and what is France doing? How does France influence the world? Because like America, where we're from, France is hugely influential worldwide, particularly in the domains of fashion and style and also cultural, internationally. So denim is actually a big product that, people often think of it as American, but a lot of it is produced in China and Japan. And it's part of this worldwide circle of textiles. And so that's the material that I'm working with a lot as I get started in France. And if you've ever been to Nîmes, there's a museum there that has a room of denim textiles because Nîmes claims to be the origin of denim, de Nîmes. And so for an exhibition later this year, actually two, one in Macau and one in Hong Kong, I am creating denim papers that will be on show there. One is for a project called Bleu de Travail, where I'm incorporating workers' clothing, which is often a blue color, kind of no matter where you are in the world, whether it's the US, whether blue collar, whether it's here with very distinctive French work clothing, or whether it's in China where blue is also a worker's color, incorporating these into just thinking about workers, what workers do, how they keep our cities functioning, and how important that work is to our world today. And the other project is called Waves of Influence. And this is commissioned by architects in Macau, which is a sister city, former Portuguese colony next to Hong Kong, a city I love very much. And I'm really honored to work with impromptu projects as part of this. And essentially, I've been researching the tiles that you see in Macau, in Portugal, and other Portuguese colonies, which are essentially a hybrid of Chinese and Portuguese European porcelain painting. So I spent a week in Portugal last year and a week recently in China learning how to do these porcelain paintings, not because I want to produce tons of porcelain myself, but essentially to understand the people who painted these tiles, that you see all over Portugal and the colonies, and also Macau. So I can design my own tile, and I will be making it out of paper, out of denim, and also out of white t-shirts, which is a first for me. It's going to be a large installation, about 25 square meters in total size, of 1 square foot sheets of paper, kind of all bound together to create a huge 2-story installation at the end of this year.
Wow, that sounds fantastic and a lot of work too.
Yeah, physical work too. This is my workout really when I'm making it.
Yeah, and I had no idea that denim came from there, from Nîmes. That's really interesting. Or they claim.
Yes. Different places claim to have, but you know what? It's all related to indigo dyeing originally, and the cotton trade and transatlantic slavery also played a role. It's quite a powerful, actually, set of conditions behind it originally. I'm not sure how much I'll talk about that in the final project, how much fits into what I'm doing, but it really interests me a lot as a material, and people in Asia are interested in it because a lot of people wear it there, people in Europe, people in the States. So I do like working with materials that speak to people in different places, with imagery that speaks to people in different places that I care about, more than one city at a time.
Definitely. And you briefly touched on this earlier, but talk a little bit about the history of papier de chiffon. Like, that has a lot of historical roots, and you're kind of retrieving this traditional method with your contemporary work. Talk a little bit about that history and your work with it.
Sure. Well, before I get too in depth about it, so I am obsessed with paper. I have been for over 20 years. I researched it. And then during the pandemic, I got an opportunity to have this machine from a museum commission in Hong Kong. And so it's portable. And so I was able to bring it here in my luggage to Paris, actually. So this machine makes a lot of stuff possible. And there's lots of different paper making traditions around the world. What I'm closely linked to is the US papermaking tradition, which became pretty widespread throughout the second half of the 20th century. And what I had noticed is that, I don't know if you know Jean Huang Caron. She makes Cookie Love here. It's an amazing cookie shop in Paris, not too far from where I live. But she's from Kansas, Taiwanese origin, but grew up in Kansas. She talks about how growing up in the Midwest, where you have lots of things growing around you, that gives you an awareness of the interaction between urban culture and also the agriculture that's right outside the city. And it was the same in Minneapolis, where I grew up next to the Mississippi River. So there was a huge culture of paper making, very 20th century, printmaking, papermaking, very kind of democratic media. So you could say that, like, painting, which is hugely prominent, it's kind of like a guitar player, it's a little more front and center, that kind of thing. But papermaking and printmaking are more democratic, where you have these machines that people need to share, and you kind of have to work together and share materials more, and they tend to be less expensive to buy. And so money is not always such a primary area of discussion around this kind of medium. And I'm sure that's what appealed to me as a young artist, though I had no clue at the time. So I worked during university at an art store where we sold 2,000 kinds of paper from around the world. And it became a way for me to travel through this material, through the media, and work with professional printmakers, bookbinders, and paper makers through this particular medium. So what I learned from that was really this place in the American kind of, it's not just crafts, it kind of hovers between artisanal and contemporary art, the way that people used it. And I really enjoyed the connection with books and literature, how it connects so many different domains of culture, both from history and also from today. So yes, going back to that, there's a lot of papier de chiffon being made in the countryside of France, especially in the Southwest. And I met some of those paper makers before moving here, just to try and understand, every area of expertise has its own ecosystem, right, in a country. And in France, it's very specific. So there's been paper made here for the close to 1,000 years. It came here from, originally it was invented in southern China, then it came over through Central Asia with the Islamic empires through southern Spain and also Italy, and then later on to France and Northern Europe. And so France's papermaking for hundreds of years was closely linked to the Dutch due to the politics at the time. And actually the little machine I have is called a Hollander beater. It's a small version of the Hollander beaters that revolutionized papermaking in Europe about 400 years ago. And the French papermaking industry totally took off around that time using this kind of machine. So how I like to think about it, these Hollander beaters, the big ones, become like portable rivers because essentially what they do is they beat the textiles for 2 hours or so, and it creates this river in your studio, and then you can make the pulp that you use to make the paper. And so in France, due to the explosion of paper making become more affordable and literacy and the printing press and all these elements coming together, there was a change in the culture of the spread of literacy and ideas. That's what brought along the Enlightenment and then later the Revolution. And so all of these things were linked to the technology. And I like to talk about that when I give talks about paper because it's more than just let's make something cute, in the studio. It's actually pretty important and can be a way to physically experience, what has happened before and the transformation of materials from one thing to the next. It's kind of magic.
Definitely. And that's fascinating what you said about 2,000 different types of paper from around the world. So like define paper, does it have to have trees in it or it doesn't even have to?
Very good question. So I'm a member of the International Association of Paper Makers and Paper Artists, and things get very technical, but I'll try to keep it fun. Paper is essentially fiber, plant fiber, and water, and something to stick it together. Not always something to stick it together. Like if you're using the mulberry tree from Southeast Asia, you often don't need to add a glue, but some paper makers will, depending on what you're using it for. Papyrus, for example, which comes from Egypt originally, and they still make it in Eastern Sicily and some other places, that is not paper because the leaves are not torn up and then beaten and then, reformed in a sheet. They are basically glued together. And it is a surface for writing, it's a surface for art, but it's not technically paper. What I make, I'm very specific about what I make now because I really think hard about myself as a Westerner. When I lived in Asia, I still work in Asia every year. I go back for a month or two. What do I represent? What is the history of where I come from? What formed the literacy and the cultural kind of currents behind where I am? So in the West, in Europe, it was for centuries, and what formed our idea of what paper is, it was rags, right? And we call it rag paper. Cotton rag is what you'll often find at the art stores like Sennelier, which I love. They have such an amazing paper department in their Quai Voltaire location. But that is really, really nice paper. And that's also what I work with because I just feel like it's a whole world to be explored. And for a lifetime, it'll take me the rest of my life to do that. In East Asia, and both in the West and in Asia, it was until industrialization, it was a renewable resource. So in the West, you had clothes that were used and they were basically recycled into paper. And then in East Asia, it was the trees that were used, sometimes bamboo, more in the countryside for like short-term papers that you would just burn for offerings. You weren't going to use them for books or anything usually. And so these trees were cut down a bit, but they grew back usually within about 3 years. So it was technically a very renewable resource. This was before plantations, before any of that. But what I learned recently was actually, because paper made with trees, like we use everyday life, it's really bad paper. It's very toxic to create, and it won't last very long, so it's not amazing as a material. And for so long, I thought, this is just really awful. But actually, what's kind of wonderful about it is that literacy grew so fast in Europe that they didn't have enough clothes to recycle. So that's why they started to use trees and chop down trees and forests and stuff, which is not ideal. We're still figuring out how to manage that. But yeah, so because we grew so literate, we needed so many books. We didn't have enough clothes to turn into books, so they turned to something else. And that, to me, I think is actually a lot of what creativity can be, is just, you have a problem, and especially in the design industries, not so much in art, contemporary art, but in design, it's really about problem solving. I'd say with art, it's more like playing with problems and asking questions. But creativity, I feel, in design, when human societies come up with something like that, I think it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And like what you said about the clothing, like not having enough to make paper and everybody's reading and books and things like that. I feel like we could bring back the clothing because like now we have too many clothes with fast fashion, but it's all like made out of plastic now. Would that even still work well for paper?
Yes, exactly. And so this is one of so many problems with fast fashion. It's actually the reason I was able to get this machine was a commission from a textile museum in Hong Kong. And they work a lot with trying to figure out how can you reuse things and recycle, all these clothing that we are discarding, especially in the West and our consumer societies, because Hong Kong is a place where a lot of the buyers come, and where, like New York, like Paris, these are three cities where a lot of the decisions that are made around fashion are made, right? And so these three cities are actually hugely influential in terms of the world's pollution, because textiles and clothing is the second biggest polluter in the world, right? So if you're using synthetics, they're not recyclable into paper, because paper essentially needs natural materials with a lot of cellulose in them. So cotton, linen, even jute is okay. It's not amazing. Hemp is really good. And then, various kind of trees, especially the mulberry tree, the kozo that grows in East Asia, is amazing, amazing for paper. And so you need the cellulose, because what happens when you beat these fibers is they get activated microscopically, actually at the atomic level. The electrons kind of go crazy and they bond together. And so that's what allows these fibers to become really quite strong, especially in the East Asian papers. So the clothes we have, what I've always tried to do for years is to look at the labels before I buy something. Most of my clothes are secondhand, but just to look at what is it made from, right? If it has synthetics in it, even rayon, it's not great for the environment. You're talking about microplastics and all this kind of stuff. And actually, in recent years, I've been buying a lot of clothes made with Japanese paper, which are totally washable and very cool on the hot summer days. So most times if you see me in the summer, I'll be wearing something with paper in it, which is also kind of fun, right? Because we don't think of paper as something you can wear, but actually societies have worn paper for centuries.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. I think this paper club you're in is fantastic. The elite paper club. And what's the craziest thing that you've ever seen paper made out of?
That is a really good question. Probably, well, I'll go back to an early experience of paper. Somebody I really admired a lot when I was a young artist and working in Minneapolis at this paper store. She's Amanda from Cave Paper. She started this paper company in a basement in the Twin Cities like 35 years ago, which is just, I don't know how she did it, because it was cold, it was totally unheated, really wet, kind of awful. But she created these amazing papers of linen and cotton and hemp rag, very traditional, kind of Western European, very much in the American 20th century tradition. But she used natural dyes on them in ways that at the time I just thought were crazy. So she would use persimmon dye from Japan, which I learned later on. Persimmon dye was often used to stiffen paper, it makes it insect repellent, it adds color, it's a natural pigment. So she would use persimmon, and then also indigo, which is more common and more people know about that. But they're both wonderful materials for paper and were used by a lot of societies for centuries, because these materials will make them last, right? So the basics, the fundamentals of paper is it's usually pH neutral naturally. You don't have to add chemicals or too much bleach to it to make it look nice. But seeing these natural dyes at the time was really mind-blowing for me. And that is part of what got me interested in paper as a way to talk about ideas through its materiality, right? Like the stuff that it's made from, and what its materials tell, and who made it, how, and why. Like I've used paper from Combat Paper, which is an American organization that works with veterans often who come back to the States from U.S. wars overseas, and they help them recycle their clothing, their uniforms into paper. It's part of the trauma processing, after they come back from the wars that we have led, and they have PTSD, and it's a really meaningful way to do something. And so I've bought some of these papers on the rare occasions that they're available. And I've worked with those too. And it's really powerful to just think about that and our roles in the world, from such a big country.
Definitely. It's such a great way to give back and do something creative and heal. I think that's really interesting. Talk a little bit about what you think the future is for paper, because we're moving towards such a digital world. Less people are, even using paper or looking at magazines, holding paper books. What do you think is the future of paper?
Absolutely. I think the future is already happening, especially in East Asia. Things are so digital that there's a lot of loss of connection with the physical world and the tactile nature of paper as material. And so what also happened in the early 21st century with photography, once photography, because you're a photographer, I'm sure you experienced this, or maybe because you're younger, but maybe you kind of came in the aftermath of that. But when digital photography became really widespread, the way that we thought about photographic images and how people thought about photography and its possibilities really changed a lot. I felt like it grew and like it expanded. So we no longer needed, film photography for everyday life. We had digital for that. And so film photography became kind of insane. Like people were trying everything. And that's how I got started with cyanotype around that time, 2003. And I think the same thing has been happening with paper for about the past decade. Or more, even maybe 15 years. So as our lives become more digital, I started to know this with the Kindle because I was working with a publisher in Hong Kong and California some years ago in Asia. And there was a lot of discussion around the Kindle and what does that mean for literacy and the experience of reading a book, And that's when I started to really research paper in Southeast Asia in earnest and just look at who was making it, why, and for what purpose. And I didn't want to get sentimental about it or say, oh, this is a disappearing art form. But I actually feel like as these forms become less utilitarian, the possibilities for them to be used in an artistic way and to be appreciated differently really explodes, really grows. And I think for a lot of us during the pandemic, with the isolation that happened, especially for children who, so I worked as artist in residence for an education foundation in Hong Kong for a total of 10 years, Hong Kong and Beijing, and was there during the pandemic. And all the teachers were telling me how the children were losing their sense of space and reality because they were with their screens all the time. Now, probably like you, I love my screen and I that's how I make a living, with working with my screen often, as well as working with paper. But I think a lot of us are now understanding more how important it is to be able to exist in 4 dimensions, which is 3 dimensions of life, but also the time that we live in as well, right? To understand that this is real and just to be able to separate that from the world we see on our screens. And the paper workshops have exploded in popularity from paper makers I know across the world, from Latin America to North Africa to East Asia. And it's actually I think it's been a really good way for us to reevaluate ways in which we can interact with the world, material world, differently.
Definitely. It's just things are changing. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's just like we're adapting and maybe finding new ways to play with how things are changing. And what advice would you give to artists considering a big geographic or cultural shift in their life or career? I mean, you've been moving all around the world, from the States to Asia to Europe. What advice do you have for other artists that want to do the same thing?
Yes, as you can imagine, I have thought about this a lot in a lot of different ways over the last 25 years. You want to think really hard about what are you wanting to do in a place? How will you interact with the people there in a way where it's reciprocal, the relationship. So I think especially when people are younger, when we travel, we always think about, wow, this place is so amazing. It's so interesting. And maybe you go shopping or maybe you learn something, but there's often a lot of taking from the culture. You take a lot and learn a lot from a place, but how are you interacting with the other artists there? Is there a cultural exchange, or is it just like you learning from a place and then kind of moving on? And if you're wanting to, long term move away from where you're from, that requires a lot of thought, a lot of planning, not just from the visa perspective, but also what are you doing that's different? How does that work within the cultural ecosystem of where you are? And what are you bringing? Like, what are you bringing to the table, right? And just that kind of self reflection is really important. And I think living in Asia, Southeast Asia, was really helpful because it was only going to be for 3 years. It ended up being a lot longer. And I had a lot of time to think about how am I contributing anything to the art scene here? Is it, are we engaging much? And in the end of the day, the East Asian and Asian art scene is primarily focused on artists from that region, which it should be, especially in these post-colonial contexts. Now, I don't want to go on a soapbox, but think about where do you come from? What does your face represent, especially if you're living in a place where people don't look like you? There will be assumptions, there will be stereotypes, and you kind of have to learn to live with that, because if you get up, kind of like living in Paris, like this morning, the Post mobile stopped working suddenly before our podcast. I had to run around like crazy and find a co-working space. But there's no point in getting upset with the Post. This stuff happens, and everybody's kind of stuck in their system. And it's like we are who we are. We're in the systems we're in, and we do the best we can with where we are. And I think it's helpful to just be kind of humble and appreciate where you are every day. Because the world's pretty amazing.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's just about being kind of a chameleon and adapting to wherever you are and not being the center of that universe.
Totally agree.
And is there a moment in your journey where you felt like you truly found your voice as an artist?
Yeah, the pandemic made a lot of us reevaluate what are we doing, kind of look back on things. And it was finally when I came to the conclusion, or when I finally admitted that, yeah, I make paper and I love working with paper. And so, there are all sorts of terms in the art world you apply to yourself, or that get applied to you, and you can resist them because in a way, I think especially as a woman, we're maybe more sensitive to this. But if you have the wrong label applied to you, that can hurt your income stream. You need to be careful how you define yourself and how other people define you. And it took me a long time to finally admit to myself, I love making paper and working with paper with this passion. What that means is I will probably not earn as much money as if I were painting or as if I were doing other kind of more sexy media. But in a sense, it's like this speaks to where I come from as the daughter of academics who grew up with 200-year-old books in the house, who grew up in the middle of the US near a river. It totally speaks to where I'm from, and just accepting that, And that helped push me, I think, to where I am now. It was only a few years ago, but it's really helped me focus, which I believe in France is very important. You need to have a focus and really something strong to say about what you're making and why.
Definitely. Well, I think that is a beautiful note to end on. And where can people check out your work, connect with you, and learn more?
You can find me on a couple of Instagram links I send you. One is more my contemporary artwork, and the other is more my paper research, news about upcoming workshops, which are just in the process of getting started. It took me months to get my CLN. I finally got it a few weeks ago. And I'll be doing stuff with the We Can Do platform, so I'll send you that link. So Instagram is probably the fastest way because that's updated the most often.
Wonderful. We'll share all of that in the show notes. And thanks so much for making time to chat with us today about the fascinating world of paper.
Thanks so much, Crystal. It was wonderful to meet you virtually, and I hope to see you in person soon.
Thanks so much for tuning in to La Vie Creative. You can find more information on MissParisPhoto.com. And if you enjoyed this show, please feel free to share and spread the word for all my creative guests. We have the power to help them to keep doing what they love. See you next time.